This past Sunday, I had one of those moments where I swear I heard the voice of God. Hi, friends, it's Marcus Haley, and this is Everyday Liturgist with me, Marcus Haley. It was during the proper preface, during the Eucharistic prayer, which is Episcopal Church speak for the prayer that we pray together during Holy Communion. The priest, in this case me, prays that it is right to give God thanks always because you, God in this case, sent your only beloved Son to redeem us from sin and death and to make us heirs in him, Jesus, of everlasting life, that when he shall come again in power and great triumph to judge the world, we may without shame or fear rejoice to behold his appearing. Now, as I prayed, it was like the words without shame or fear were vibrating on the page, like the numbers on the computer screen in the Apple TV show Severance. Now, I've had this experience before. This past summer, I entered a discernment process with the folks in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts. And so I decided to go on a silent retreat with the brothers at Holy Cross Monastery in Poughkeepsie, New York, so that I could listen and hear from God. And if you know anything about monks, you know that they pray a lot. And every time we would pray as a community, every time the word trust showed up in the prayers or the psalms, it was like the word trust leapt off the page, almost as if God was reminding me to trust him, regardless of what the future held. Now, I'm sure there is much more to without shame or fear than this, but at least one of the things that occurs to me in this moment is how much this message that God invites us into a life of joy, free of shame and fear, how much this is not the dominant message of Christianity. A shame and fear-free Christianity is certainly not my experience growing up. Between the rapture and hell and the way the church talked about, or let's be real, didn't talk about sex and sexuality, shame and fear were everywhere. Even now, popular Christianity feels stuck, feels mired in shame and grievance and fear and suspicion. Every time Christianity shows up on the popular media, it's always complaining about something. We, and I say we because I try to make it a practice not to draw lines between myself and others, even if they draw lines to exclude me. And I get this from Pauli Murray, who said, when my brothers draw a circle that excludes me, I will draw an even wider circle that includes them. And so I say we Christians too often see enemies and opponents where God invites us to see neighbors and friends and companions. And let's be real. This all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We end up with the world we're looking for. This is how R.F. Kuang, one of my favorite authors, talks about hell in her newest novel, Catabasis, which is all about a student named Alice, her descent into a fictional depiction of hell. And in this book, Kuang says this: what you experience in hell is just a final ripple effect of your original evil. You get exactly what you asked for. And I think the whole point of hell is to show you the full extent of what you wanted. When we want to see enemies everywhere, we should not be surprised when we do in fact begin to see enemies everywhere. Now, there are so many problems with fear and shame, but one of the reasons why Jesus calls us away from fear and shame is because of what happens to us when we are deep in fear and deep in shame. Brené Brown says that shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging, which is, every time I read and remember that quote, that definition of shame, I have to take a breath. I gotta let that sink in. Because I vividly remember the particular sort of shame that can emerge from Christian faith. This deep sense that I am too flawed, too broken, too sinful, too wicked, too human to belong to God, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. But shame lies to us. Shame turns us from God, and fear turns us toward idols. I have this belief, and my students have heard this repeatedly, that Christianity is ultimately about freedom. God made us to be free, and our freedom is sustained to the degree that we use our freedom rightly. We use our freedom in the accordance with God's will, but we don't. Let's be clear, we do not use our freedom this way. We are constantly giving our freedom away to idols and dehumanizing systems and destructive ways of living that ultimately enslave us. We believe the lies of fear and shame. And in so doing, we give our freedom away to idols that promise security and belonging, but are ultimately powerless to save us. And this helps me understand a bit of what I see happening around us politically in this moment. The unheard and unhealed fear and shame pushes so many toward the idols of power and racial and ethnic chauvinism that promise security and safety and belonging in a world where so many people feel unmoored. Unfortunately, there are too many people who would exploit this fear and this shame rather than speak to folks in ways that can actually provide healing and a path forward. I'm no politician. I am merely a priest. But I believe that what we need in this moment of deep fear and pain is a politics that speaks to the fear and pain we experience by calling forth what President Abraham Lincoln referred to in his first inaugural address as the better angels of our nature: empathy, compassion, and connection. Folks are afraid, and far too often our response to fear that we don't agree with or fear that we don't understand is to try to argue people out of it. We tell folks that their fear is irrational, it is unfounded, or even undeserved. I see this so often in my work as a college chaplain. The black and white thinking of late adolescence and early adulthood, combined with the unwieldy power of new knowledge, causes the zero-sum and fear and shame-based politics of our wider culture to distill on college campuses in extreme and dehumanizing ways. Disagreement invites hostility rather than curiosity and intellectual engagement, and discomfort automatically equates to danger. We fail to remember that empathy is not a scarce resource. There is room for all of us if we're willing to make room for all of us. Sharing each other's fear and pain does not diminish the significance of either. In fact, we might find that when we truly share one another's fear and shame and pain, we begin to see each other in a new light. We might even begin to see each other as human. And so if Jesus invites us out of shame and fear, what does he invite us into? What is the opposite of shame? What is the opposite of fear? Well, I think that the opposite of fear and shame is love and humility. Perhaps the best lesson I've ever received on humility was taught to me by a Buddhist nun a few years ago. I was holding a vigil on our campus that turned out to be a sort of disaster. It was right after the October 7 attacks on Israel and the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza. Hindsight is 2020, and in retrospect, there was too much anger in the community to try to bring people together. Right? The writer of Ecclesiastes is right in this regard. For everything there is a season, a time to love and a time to hate, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. I could tell at the beginning of the vigil that the vibes in the room were off, that this thing was about to become a disaster. And so I remember saying something at the beginning of the vigil like, I feel inadequate to the task of calling our community together in this moment. And a Buddhist nun, uncharacteristically but thankfully, immediately interjected. Humbled, she said. You feel humbled. She was right. I thought I felt inadequate, but that's because I misunderstood my place in the grand scheme of things. As desperately as I wanted to solve all of the problems, the terrorism, the unfolding genocide, the decades of displacement, the centuries of trauma, and the pervasive fear, all the stuff that people were bringing into that room, as much as I wanted to solve it and to heal it, I couldn't. What I could do was sit with folks in it and to offer the possibility of human connection, even if it was ultimately rejected by many in that room. Humility is simply understanding our proper place in things. The word humility comes from the same Latin root word as the Latin word for earth, humus, which makes me think of the line that we're going to hear on Ash Wednesday. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. There is perhaps no greater piece or passage of wisdom or scripture that sums up humility than that. The opposite of shame is cultivating a proper understanding of our place in God's world. We are dust, animated by the loving breath of God, but dust nonetheless. So that's humility, the opposite of shame. Love, the opposite of fear, is at the heart of God. 1 Corinthians 13 has perhaps one of the greatest explanations about love that I've ever read. Love is great-hearted. Love is kind. Love knows no jealousy. Love makes no fuss. Love is not puffed up. Love does not have shameless ways. Love doesn't force its rightful claim. Love doesn't rage or bear a grudge. It doesn't cheer at others' harm. Love rejoices rather in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things. Love hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. This great-hearted love is what God embodies for us in Jesus, and what God invites each of us to embody for one another. In an inhumane culture defined by shame and fear, love and humility are virtues we must practice over and over and over again until they become second nature to us. I like what N.T. Wright says about virtue. He says that virtue is what happens when our habitual choices have been wise. To live without shame and fear is to receive and practice humility and love. How? Well, I think it starts with prayer, with asking God to help us develop these virtues in our lives. Joan Chittister says that prayer is the natural response of people who know their place in the universe. So merely to pray is to practice humility. Praying to God the Father through Jesus the Son in the power of the Spirit is opening ourselves to the love that is the ground of all being. Prayer is always a good place to start. And if you don't know how to pray, simply pause, take a deep breath, and pray the prayer Jesus taught us, the Lord's Prayer, and see where that takes you. The ironic thing about prayer is that the desire to pray is itself both a prayer and evidence that the one who desires to pray is already in the loving presence of God. Take that, shame. I like to close with a gratitude practice. Wherever you find yourself listening to this, I invite you to call to mind one thing for which you are grateful today. Just one thing. While you think about yours, I will share mine. We are at the end of our semester. Our students are all stressed out about exams, final projects and papers, and going home. And in this moment, I find myself really grateful for my students. As a chaplain, I get to watch young people grow in ways that are astonishing and astounding and wonderful. I am humbled by the work that God invites me to do with them, and I'm grateful for the people they are and for the people they are becoming. And I'm grateful for you for listening to this podcast. Thanks for listening to Everyday Liturgist with Marcus Hilly. You can find us on Substack, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. This whole thing is new, so I hope you'll leave a comment and a 5-star review. It helps us to get our name out there and help other people to find this podcast who might need it. I also hope that you might share this podcast with a friend. If you have questions or comments about today's episode or about anything about faith, leave it in the comments on Substack or send me an email, everydayliturgist@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, remember, life is short, and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who make this journey with us. So be swift to love and make haste to be kind. Until we meet again, peace.